Today's video is absolutely wild. My entitled neighbor secretly built an entire playground on my property while I was away on vacation, then tried to claim adverse possession when I confronted her about it. But wait until you see how I turned the tables and used her own entitlement against her. Let's dive right into this crazy story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know, it's funny how you think you know your neighbors until something like this happens. I've been living in my house in Cedar Grove for about 7 years now. It's a beautiful property with almost 2 acres of land backing up to a small, wooded area. I bought it specifically because I loved having that extra space and privacy. The previous owners had used part of it for a garden, but I mostly just maintained it as a natural space where local wildlife could thrive. I'd see deer, foxes, even the occasional turkey wandering through. It was my own little slice of paradise. When Sarah and her family moved in next door about 3 years ago, everything seemed fine at first. They had 3 kids, all under 10, and while they were definitely louder than my previous neighbors, I tried to be understanding. I remember helping them unload their moving truck and bringing over a homemade lasagna that first week. Sarah seemed grateful, if a bit entitled about accepting help. You know the type. Acting like your assistance was expected rather than appreciated. Still, I brushed it off. We all have our quirks, right? Over the next couple of years, I started noticing little things. Sarah's kids would occasionally play in my yard, which I didn't mind too much, as long as they were respectful. But Sarah never asked permission. She just assumed it was fine. Sometimes I'd find toys left scattered around, and once they even set up a temporary volleyball net without asking. Each time, I'd politely mention it to Sarah, and she'd give this dismissive laugh and say something like, "Oh, you know how kids are. Besides, you're not using all this space anyway." Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. The way she'd make comments about my empty yard being wasted space. How she'd hint that her kids needed somewhere proper to play since their own backyard was too small. But you never want to believe someone would go as far as she did. That's what makes this story so insane. I went on a 3-week vacation to visit my sister in Europe, something I'd been planning for months. I even told Sarah I'd be gone, thinking she might keep an eye on the place. Well, she kept an eye on it all right, but not in the way I expected. What happened next is so outrageous that if I didn't have security cameras and documentation, people probably wouldn't believe it. When I got back from my vacation, exhausted from a 9-hour flight and just wanting to sleep in my own bed, I walked into a nightmare that would lead to one of the most satisfying acts of revenge I've ever had to orchestrate. But before I tell you exactly what I found in my backyard and how I handled it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss how this story ends. I'm talking about building permits, property surveys, and a twist that even Sarah's own husband didn't see coming. So let's start at the beginning of that day I came home from vacation. When I first noticed something was very, very wrong with my backyard, I dragged my suitcase up the driveway, noticing something odd immediately. There were fresh tire tracks in my side yard, the kind you'd see from heavy construction equipment. At first, I thought maybe the utility company had been doing work while I was gone, though it seemed strange they hadn't notified me. But then I heard it. The sound of children laughing and what seemed like metal chains squeaking rhythmically. My first thought was that some neighborhood kids had wandered onto my property to play. It wouldn't be the first time, and usually a polite reminder about private property was enough to send them home. But as I rounded the corner of my house, I stopped dead in my tracks, my suitcase handle slipping from my grip and clattering to the ground. There, taking up nearly a quarter acre of my back property, was a full professional-grade playground complex. We're not talking about some simple swing set you'd buy at Home Depot. This was the kind of setup you'd see at an upscale public park or an expensive private school. There were multiple swing sets with both regular and toddler swings. A massive tube slide that curved around like a corkscrew, one of those giant spider-web climbing structures made of thick rope, and even a cushioned ground surface made of that. Expensive rubber material they use at commercial playgrounds. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Sarah was sitting in a lawn chair next to the playground, casually scrolling through her phone, while her kids and what looked like half the neighborhood children played on my property. She looked up. When she heard my suitcase fall, and I'll never forget what she did next, she smiled and waved as if everything was perfectly normal. "Welcome back," she called out cheerfully, like she was greeting me at a neighborhood barbecue. "The kids are loving the new playground. You should see how popular it's made the neighborhood." I stood there, mouth hanging open, trying to process what I was seeing. The playground must have cost at least $30,000, probably more. It was professionally installed. You could tell from the concrete footings and the perfect leveling of the ground. This wasn't some weekend DIY project. This was a major construction undertaking that had required serious planning and equipment. What? How? When did this happen? I finally managed to sputter out, my jet lag forgotten in the face of this surreal situation. Sarah stood up, brushing off her yoga pants as if we were about to have a casual chat about the weather. "Oh, we got it all done in about a week. The installation team was amazing. They even worked through that rainy day we had last Tuesday. I figured since you were going to be gone for 3 weeks, it was the perfect time to get it all set up, without disturbing you." The casual way she said it, like she'd done me a favor by waiting until I was out of the country to completely alter my property without permission, made my blood boil. But what she said next nearly made me lose it entirely. "I've already set up a neighborhood playground committee," she continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring my growing anger. "We're thinking of doing a small membership fee for maintenance. Nothing crazy, maybe just $50 per family per month. Of course, since it's on your property, you won't have to pay anything. Isn't that great?" I looked around again, taking in more details that my shocked brain had initially missed. There were benches installed around the perimeter. A small storage shed that definitely hadn't been there 3 weeks ago sat in the corner, presumably filled with extra toys and equipment. They'd even installed outdoor lighting on tall poles, the kind that automatically come on at dusk. Standing there, watching at least a dozen kids climbing, swinging and sliding on this unauthorized playground complex, I realized I wasn't just dealing with an entitled neighbor who'd overstepped her bounds. This was a calculated move that Sarah had clearly been planning for months. She'd waited until I was literally out of the country to execute her plan, probably hoping that once everything was installed and being used, I'd be too conflict-averse to do anything about it. Little did she know, she'd just made one of the biggest mistakes of her life. To understand just how outrageous Sarah's actions were, you need to know a bit about our neighborhood and the history of my property. Cedar Grove wasn't always the sought-after suburb it is today. When I bought my house 7 years ago, it was still what real estate agents politely called an emerging area. The large lot sizes were a remnant of the area's farming history. Most properties here used to be small family farms that were gradually subdivided as the city expanded. My property in particular has an interesting history that I learned about during the purchasing process. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Thompson, had lived here for over 4 decades. He'd actually owned both my lot and what is now Sarah's property as a single piece of land. Back in the 1980s, he'd subdivided it to help pay for his wife's medical expenses, selling off what would later become Sarah's lot while keeping the larger portion with the original farmhouse, my current home. The thing is, Mr. Thompson was meticulous about property documentation. When he subdivided the land, he had everything professionally surveyed and recorded. He even installed permanent survey markers, those metal pins with colored caps that surveyors use, at every corner of both properties. He showed me all of them when I bought the place, explaining how important it was to maintain clear boundaries. "Good fences make good neighbors," he'd said with a knowing smile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I remember being impressed by his attention to detail, especially when he handed me a folder containing all the survey documents, property maps, and even photos of the survey markers. At the time, I thought he was being a bit overly cautious. Now I realize he might have had experience with neighbors trying to encroach on his land. The irony is that Sarah and her family bought their house specifically because of the location and schools, but they didn't do their homework about the property itself. Their lot is about half the size of mine, which is pretty standard for the newer subdivisions in the area. They paid almost as much as I did for my place, despite having less than half the land, because property values had skyrocketed in the years between our purchases. I'd actually heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Sarah had tried to negotiate with the previous owners of her house to buy a portion of my land before I purchased it. She'd apparently had grand plans even then about expanding their yard. But Mr. Thompson had been firm. He wanted the property sold as a single piece to preserve the natural area he'd maintained for wildlife. That's another crucial bit of background. The part of my property where Sarah built her unauthorized playground isn't just empty space. It's part of a small wildlife corridor that connects several larger wooded areas in our suburb. Mr. Thompson had worked with a local conservation group to plant native species and create habitat for local wildlife. I'd continued this tradition, adding bird feeders and a small pond. The area had become a registered way station for monarch butterflies, and we'd regularly see deer, foxes, and all sorts of birds. Sarah knew all this. When they first moved in, I'd enthusiastically shared the history of the properties with her family. I'd even invited her kids to help me fill the bird feeders and taught them about the different species we'd see. But it became clear pretty quickly that Sarah saw the wildlife aspect as a nuisance rather than a feature. She'd complain about deer eating her garden plants, despite my offering to help her install deer-resistant fencing, and would make comments about how all this space was being wasted on animals. The way the properties were laid out, Sarah's house sat closer to the street than mine, with a relatively small backyard. Meanwhile, my house was set further back, with most of my land behind and to one side of the house. From her back deck, Sarah had a clear view of my entire yard, something that apparently had been fueling her sense of entitlement since they moved in. I'd noticed over the past year that she'd started hosting these elaborate playdates in her small yard, clearly trying to demonstrate to other parents how cramped their space was. She'd make pointed comments during neighborhood barbecues about how the kids needed more room to run around and how some people just don't appreciate what they have. Looking back now, I can see how she'd been laying the groundwork for this playground scheme for months, maybe even years. She'd been carefully cultivating sympathy among other neighbors, particularly those with young children, trying to create this narrative that I was somehow selfish for not letting her family use my land as they pleased. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she never bothered to ask, was that I had my own plans for that space. Plans that were now going to play a crucial role in how this whole situation unfolded. I should probably tell you a bit about myself because it helps explain why Sarah's actions were an even bigger mistake than she realized. I'm not just some passive homeowner who doesn't know their rights. I'm actually an environmental lawyer, specializing in land use and conservation cases. The irony of Sarah choosing to build her unauthorized playground on my property still makes me chuckle when I think about it. For the past 15 years, I've worked with conservation groups and private landowners to protect natural spaces from exactly the kind of unauthorized development Sarah had just pulled. My firm has handled dozens of cases involving property disputes, easement violations, and yes, even adverse possession claims, which, as you'll see, becomes relevant later in this story. But here's the thing. Despite my profession, I've always tried to be a reasonable, friendly neighbor. When I moved into Cedar Grove, I made a point of introducing myself to everyone on the block. I've hosted annual summer barbecues where the whole neighborhood is welcome, and I've never been the type to make a fuss about minor issues like kids occasionally cutting across my yard or balls landing in my garden. My work has taught me that most property disputes can be resolved through open communication and mutual respect. That's why I'd always made an effort to be approachable and flexible with neighbors. If Sarah had come to me before I left for vacation and asked about setting up a play area, we probably could have worked something out. Maybe a compromise involving a smaller play structure in a different location, with proper agreements and safety measures in place. I'm also pretty involved in our local community. I volunteer at the nature center downtown, teaching kids about local wildlife and conservation. I've helped several neighbors navigate zoning issues when they wanted to add decks or fences to their improperties. I even served on the city's environmental advisory board for a few years, helping draft guidelines for sustainable development in our growing suburb. What makes this situation particularly frustrating is that I'd actually been working on a proposal for that part of my property. Over the past year, I'd been in talks with a local educational non-profit about establishing a natural playground and outdoor classroom space. Unlike Sarah's metal and plastic monstrosity, this would have been a carefully planned installation that worked with the existing landscape. Think natural climbing structures made from fallen logs, native plant gardens, and outdoor learning stations where kids could actually connect with nature. The project would have been funded through grants, properly permitted, and most importantly, it would have been accessible to the whole community, while still preserving the wildlife corridor. I'd even drawn up preliminary plans that included insurance coverage, maintenance agreements, and educational programming. All of that was now jeopardized by Sarah's unauthorized construction. But perhaps the most relevant thing about me in this situation is that I'm methodical and detail-oriented. Some might call it being a bit obsessive, but I document everything. Before leaving for my vacation, I'd taken detailed photos of my entire property, including the area where Sarah built her playground. It's just something I do regularly for insurance purposes. I also had security cameras installed, not the obvious ones you can see from the street, but well-hidden trail cameras that I use to monitor wildlife activity. I maintain a detailed log of all interactions with neighbors, especially when it comes to property-related discussions. Every time Sarah had made comments about wanting to use my land, every time her kids had played in my yard without permission, it was all documented with dates and specific details. At the time, it seemed a bit excessive even to me, but my legal background had taught me that documentation is everything. I'm also not someone who acts rashly. Even standing there, looking at this unauthorized playground that had literally appeared on my property while I was out of the country, I didn't lose my temper. Instead, I started mentally cataloging everything I was seeing, noting details that would be important later. The extent of the ground disturbance, the permanent nature of the installations, the commercial grade of the equipment. Years of legal practice had taught me that the best response to outrageous behavior isn't immediate confrontation. It's careful documentation followed by strategic action. So, while part of me wanted to start yelling at Sarah right there in my backyard, I knew that wouldn't be productive. Instead, I smiled, took out my phone and started casually taking pictures, appearing to all the world like I was just documenting the wonderful new addition to my property. What Sarah didn't realize, as she sat there smugly in her lawn chair, was that she hadn't just picked a fight with a passive neighbor. She'd chosen to go up against someone who knew exactly how to handle this situation in a way that would make her regret ever thinking she could get away with this. My relationship with Sarah and her family had started out promisingly enough. When they first moved in 3 years ago, I'd made an effort to welcome them just as I did with all new neighbors. I remember bringing over a welcome basket filled with local treats, including honey from my own beehives, another detail that would become relevant later. The first sign of what was to come appeared during that very first interaction. While her husband Tom seemed genuinely appreciative of the gesture, Sarah's response was different. She'd looked at the honey jar with barely concealed disdain and said, "Oh, how rustic. We usually get our organic honey from Whole Foods, but I'm sure this is nice too." Tom had looked embarrassed, quickly jumping in to thank me and ask about the neighborhood. Over the next few months, I noticed a pattern in our interactions. Sarah would be perfectly friendly when she wanted something, but there was always an underlying current of entitlement. She'd borrow my gardening tools without asking, then return them days later, often dirty or damaged. When I'd mention it, she'd wave it off with comments like, "Oh, we're neighbors, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, right?" Then there were the play dates. At first, it was just her kids occasionally wandering into my yard while playing. I didn't mind too much. Kids are kids, after all. But gradually, Sarah started hosting larger and larger groups of children, and my yard became their default overflow space. She never asked permission, she just assumed it was fine. I remember one particular incident about a year ago that really highlighted her attitude. She'd organized a birthday party for her middle child, complete with a bouncy castle and dozens of kids. Without any discussion, she'd set up half the party activities in my yard. When I came home from work to find tables, chairs, and party decorations spread across my property, I was understandably concerned about liability issues. "Sarah," I'd said, trying to be diplomatic, "I appreciate you wanting to give the kids space to play, but I really need to be consulted before you set up events. In my yard, there are insurance considerations." She'd cut me off with a laugh. "Oh, don't be such a worrywart. The kids are having fun, and it's not like you're using the space. Besides, I told all the parents that we had permission." That last part had stopped me in my tracks. "You told them you had permission, but you never asked me." "Well, you've never said no before," she'd replied with a shrug. "And really, it's kind of selfish to keep all this space to yourself when there are so many families in the neighborhood who could use it." I documented that conversation carefully, along with photos of the party setup. At the time, it seemed like just another example of Sarah's entitled behavior. Now looking back, I can see it was a test. She was pushing boundaries, seeing what she could get away with. Our interactions continued in this vein, with Sarah constantly trying to expand her use of my property. She'd plant flowers along the property line, gradually moving them further and further onto my land. She'd clean up areas of natural growth that she deemed messy, removing native plants I'd specifically cultivated for wildlife. Even our casual conversations had an undercurrent of territorial expansion. She'd make comments like, "You know, if you're not going to use all this space, you really should consider selling some of it. I know a family, wink wink, who would be very interested." Or she'd sigh dramatically while watching her kids play in their smaller yard, saying things like, "It's just so cramped here. If only someone would be willing to share their unused space." Tom, her husband, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior. He'd often try to rein her in or apologize for her more blatant boundary crossings. I'd catch him watching, with a worried expression, when she'd make her passive-aggressive comments at neighborhood gatherings. Once he'd even pulled me aside at a block party. "Look, he'd said quietly. "I know Sarah can be a bit much sometimes. She's just really focused on giving the kids the best possible childhood. But I've told her she needs to respect property. Boundaries." That conversation took on new meaning after the playground incident. It made me wonder how much Tom knew about Sarah's plans. Had he tried to stop her? Was he even aware of what she was planning to do while I was away? What's particularly interesting about our relationship is how Sarah had managed to craft a narrative in the neighborhood where she was somehow the reasonable one and I was the uncooperative neighbor. She'd tell other parents how she'd tried so hard to work with me, how she'd made so many reasonable requests that I'd rejected. It was masterful manipulation, really. By the time she built the playground, she'd already laid the groundwork. To paint herself as the hero of the story, just trying to create something nice for the neighborhood kids. Little did she know, her careful groundwork was about to backfire spectacularly. The specific spot where Sarah chose to build her playground couldn't have been more perfectly chosen to cause maximum damage, both to the environment and to her eventual legal position. You see, that particular corner of my property wasn't just random unused space. It was actually one of the most carefully planned and environmentally significant areas of the entire lot. When I first bought the property, I'd worked with a local environmental consultant to map out the entire space. We'd identified several distinct micro-ecosystems, including a seasonal wetland area that formed during spring rains. This natural depression in the land served as a crucial stopping point for migrating birds and provided breeding grounds for several species of native amphibians. The area where Sarah built her playground sat right at the edge of this seasonal wetland. The natural slope of the land meant that water would flow directly from her newly installed rubber playground surface into this sensitive habitat. The installation team had clearly leveled the ground, disrupting the natural drainage patterns that had developed over decades. I could already see where they'd filled in part of the depression with gravel and concrete for the playground footings. But it wasn't just the environmental impact that made this location significant. This particular corner of my property was also subject to a conservation easement, a legal agreement I'd signed with a local land trust just the previous year. The easement was part of a larger wildlife corridor project, connecting several green spaces throughout our suburb. I'd received a significant tax benefit for placing this portion of my land under protection, but more importantly, I'd made a legal commitment to preserve it in its natural state. The irony of Sarah's choice was almost painful. Out of my entire 2-acre property, she'd managed to pick the one spot that was not only environmentally sensitive, but also legally protected by multiple overlapping agreements. The playground didn't just violate my property rights. It violated state environmental regulations, local zoning laws, and the terms of my conservation easement. I took a closer look at the playground installation while pretending to admire it. The main support posts were sunk deep into concrete footings. This wasn't some temporary structure that could be easily removed. They'd cleared native vegetation, installed drainage systems, and laid down that rubber safety surfacing that's required for commercial playgrounds. The whole setup occupied about 2,500 square feet, nearly the size of Sarah's entire backyard. The construction had destroyed several important natural features. There was a fallen oak log that had been home to a thriving ecosystem of fungi and insects, now replaced by a plastic tube slide. A cluster of native berry bushes that provided food for birds had been ripped out to make way for the swing set. Even the carefully maintained topsoil layer, built up over years of natural processes, had been scraped away and replaced with compacted fill. Walking around the perimeter of the playground, I noticed they'd also installed underground electrical lines for the lighting system. This meant they'd dug trenches across my property, potentially damaging tree roots and disrupting the complex network of mycorrhizal fungi that connected the mature trees in the area. The lights themselves were mounted on tall poles, creating light pollution that would affect nocturnal wildlife and interfere with the natural behavior patterns of the local bat population. What made it even worse was that this area had been part of my ongoing research project. As an environmental lawyer, I'd been documenting the success of various restoration techniques, creating a case study for other urban wildlife corridors. I had motion-activated cameras set up to track wildlife movements, soil moisture sensors to monitor groundwater levels, and tagged plants that we were studying for climate adaptation. Sarah's playground had essentially destroyed 3 years of careful data collection. The location was also significant from a neighborhood perspective. This corner of my property was visible from several neighboring houses, which explained part of Sarah's strategy. By placing the playground here, she'd created a situation where removing it would make me look like the villain to the entire neighborhood. She'd positioned it perfectly to be seen from her back deck, making it easy for her to monitor and control its use. But what Sarah couldn't have known was that this visibility would ultimately work against her. Every aspect of the playground's construction had been captured by my wildlife cameras, providing a detailed record of exactly who had been involved in this unauthorized project. The cameras had also caught several preliminary visits by Sarah and what appeared to be contractors, proving that this wasn't some spontaneous decision, but a carefully planned operation. Standing there, looking at the destruction of years of conservation work, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Sarah hadn't just built a playground, she'd handed me every legal tool I needed to respond to this situation decisively. The location she'd chosen, probably based solely on its convenience and visibility, would prove to be her biggest mistake. The destruction of my wildlife sanctuary wasn't just about environmental damage or property rights. It represented the loss of something deeply personal. That space had been my therapy, my passion project, and a living memorial to my late father, who had taught me everything I knew about conservation. Dad had been a forest ranger for 30 years before he passed away. Some of my earliest memories are of him teaching me about different bird calls, showing me how to identify native plants, and explaining why every creature, no matter how small, played an important role in the ecosystem. When I bought this property, one of the first things I did was create a natural space that would have made him proud. The berry bushes that had been ripped out, those were propagated from cuttings taken from my father's own garden. The oak log that was now replaced by a plastic slide had been carefully positioned as part of a natural playground concept my dad and I had discussed before he passed. He always said that kids needed to connect with nature through play, but in a way that respected the environment. Nature is the best teacher, he used to say. You just have to give kids the chance to learn from it. The irony of Sarah destroying this natural learning space to install a commercial playground wasn't lost on me. I had spent countless weekend hours in this corner of my property, carefully tending to the native plants, monitoring wildlife activity, and maintaining the delicate balance of the micro-ecosystem. Each spring, I would lead small groups of local school children on nature walks, teaching them about the same things my father had taught me. We'd watch tadpoles develop in the seasonal pond, observe birds building nests, and learn about the importance of preserving natural spaces in our increasingly developed suburb. The destruction went beyond just the physical changes. Sarah's playground had disrupted years of careful habitat development. The monarch butterfly way station I'd created, certified by the National Wildlife Federation, was now partially paved over. The carefully maintained brush piles that provided shelter for small mammals and birds were gone, replaced by benches and that garish rubber surfacing. I had documentation of every species that had made this space their home. The family of Bard, Owls that nested in the large oak tree every spring, the box turtles that laid their eggs in the sandy soil near the seasonal wetland, even the rare native orchids I'd been nurturing in the shade garden. All of this was meticulously recorded in my nature journals, with photographs, dates, and observations spanning the 7 years I'd owned the property. This space was also where I'd developed my passion for wildlife photography. I had a small blind set up where I could sit quietly and capture images of animals in their natural habitat. Some of my photos had even been published in local nature magazines, helping to raise awareness about urban wildlife corridors. The blind was now gone, presumably demolished during the playground construction, but perhaps most personally significant was the meditation garden I'd created in memory of my father. It was a small, quiet space with a stone bench nestled among native ferns and wildflowers. I'd placed one of his old ranger badges there, embedded in a small concrete marker. The playground's drainage system had been dug right through this area, completely destroying this private memorial. The financial value of what was lost was significant. Between the rare native plants, the specialized habitat features, and the research equipment, we were talking about thousands of dollars, but the emotional value was immeasurable. This wasn't just land to me. It was a living connection to my father's memory and a manifestation of the values he'd instilled in me. Sarah's actions hadn't just violated property laws, they'd desecrated a space that held deep personal meaning. Each time I looked at the gleaming, metal playground equipment, I saw not just an unauthorized structure, but the destruction of countless hours of careful stewardship and personal remembrance. What made it even more painful was that I had actually been working on plans to share this space with the community in a responsible way. I'd been developing educational programs, working with local schools to create outdoor learning opportunities, and designing natural play areas that would allow children to interact with nature without destroying it. All of these plans were now in jeopardy because of Sarah's unilateral decision to impose her vision on my property. The personal nature of this loss steeled my resolve. This wasn't just about defending property rights or environmental regulations anymore. This was about protecting something that meant far more than Sarah could possibly understand. As I stood there, watching her children swing on equipment installed over what had been a carefully cultivated wildlife habitat, I knew that my response needed to address not just the legal violations, but the profound disrespect for everything this space represented. I decided to handle the initial confrontation carefully, knowing that how I approached this first interaction would set the tone for everything that followed. After taking several photos of the playground and the surrounding damage, I walked over to where Sarah was still sitting in her lawn chair, tapping away on her phone. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional, "I see you've been busy while I was away. Could you tell me more about this project?" She looked up from her phone with that same self-satisfied smile. "Isn't it wonderful? The kids absolutely love it. We've already had so many compliments from other parents in the neighborhood. They're all saying how nice it is that this space is finally being put to good use." I noticed she was recording our conversation on her phone, trying to be subtle about it, but not quite succeeding. Perfect. This would actually work in my favor later. "And who exactly authorized this construction?" I asked, maintaining a calm, curious tone. "Oh, don't worry about all that bureaucratic stuff," she waved her hand dismissively. "We took care of everything. The playground company was very professional. They handle these kinds of installations all the time." I pulled out my own phone and started openly recording. "Just to be clear, Sarah, you're saying you arranged for this playground to be built on my property while I was out of the country, without my knowledge or consent?" Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Well, technically it's on your property, but let's be realistic here. You weren't using this space for anything important, just some weeds and wildlife stuff. This is much better for the community. And really, you should be thanking me. This has increased your property value significantly." I noticed several other parents had gathered around, drawn by our conversation. Sarah's voice got a bit louder, clearly playing to her audience. "Besides," she continued, "we've already started a neighborhood playground committee. Everyone's very excited about it. We're planning regular events, maintenance schedules. It's bringing the whole community together. You wouldn't want to be the one to take that away from the children, would you?" And there it was. Her strategy laid bare. She was trying to create a situation where any attempt to remove the playground would make me look like the villain. I could see several parents nodding along with her, some filming with their phones. "That's fascinating," I replied, still maintaining my professional demeanor. "And the construction permits, the environmental impact studies, the liability insurance. I'd love to see those documents." Sarah's smile became a bit fixed. "Oh, we can handle all that paperwork later. The important thing is that the kids have a safe place to play now. And like I said, we're handling all the maintenance and organization. You don't have to do anything except enjoy having such a wonderful addition to your property." I noticed Tom, Sarah's husband, had appeared on their back deck, looking increasingly uncomfortable as he observed our interaction. He started walking over, probably sensing the tension in the air. "Actually, Sarah," I said, just as Tom arrived, "there's quite a bit I need to do now. As the property owner, I'm legally liable for any accidents that might occur here. And since this structure was built without permits, without environmental review, and in violation of several state and local regulations, I need to ask everyone to leave immediately. This playground is officially closed." The reaction was immediate. Sarah jumped up from her chair, her face flushing. "You can't do that. We've already invested thousands of dollars in this. The children need this playground." "Sarah," Tom interjected, looking increasingly alarmed. "What did you do?" "What I had to do," she snapped at him. "Someone had to take action to give our kids the space they deserve, and now that it's built, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Adverse possession laws mean—" I cut her off. "Actually, Sarah, I'm quite familiar with adverse possession laws. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I can assure you, building a playground on someone's property while they're on vacation doesn't qualify. Now I'm going to ask one more time for everyone to leave my property while I contact the relevant authorities." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and then something that looked almost like triumph. "Well, if you want to be difficult about this, fine. But remember, I have documentation of you allowing us to use this space in the past. And now the whole neighborhood will see what kind of person you really are. Destroying something that benefits everyone just because you're obsessed with your precious wildlife." Little did Sarah know. But with those words, she had just handed me exactly what I needed to proceed with my next steps. As the crowd of parents and children reluctantly began dispersing from my property, I immediately put my professional training into action. The first thing I did was call my firm's office and ask them to send over our property litigation team. Then I called the local police non-emergency number to file a report about the unauthorized construction. While waiting for the police to arrive, I methodically documented everything. I walked the perimeter of the playground with my phone's camera recording, capturing not just the structure itself, but all the environmental damage around it. I made sure to get clear footage of the conservation easement markers that had been literally paved over and the destroyed research equipment that had been tossed aside like garbage. Sarah stood watching from her deck, still filming with her phone, probably hoping to catch me doing something she could use against me. I could hear her narrating dramatically to her camera about how unreasonable I was being, and how this was typical behavior from someone who cares more about plants than children. I ignored her performance and continued my documentation. I pulled out my tablet and began creating a detailed timeline of events, starting with my departure date for vacation. and including every detail I could remember about previous conversations with Sarah about property boundaries. I also made note of which neighbors were present and had been using the playground, as they might need to be deposed later. Tom approached me cautiously while I was working. "Listen," he said quietly, looking over his shoulder to make sure Sarah couldn't hear. "I had no idea she was planning this. I was away on business when the construction started, and by the time I got back—" He trailed off, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Tom," I replied, keeping my voice equally low, "I understand you're in a difficult position, but I need to ask, did you sign any contracts with the playground company, or were you involved in any of the planning?" He shook his head emphatically. "No, Sarah handled everything. She told me she had all the necessary permissions. I only saw the credit card charges after they went through." He paused, then added, "I should have known something wasn't right when she insisted on doing it while you were away." I nodded, making notes of his statement. "I appreciate your honesty, Tom. You might want to start gathering any documentation you have about this: contracts, payments, communications with the playground company. You'll probably need them." Just then, 2 police officers arrived. Sarah immediately rushed down from her deck, launching into her well-rehearsed story about how I had verbally agreed to let her use the space, and how she was just trying to do something nice for the neighborhood. I calmly presented the officers with my property deed, the conservation easement documentation, and photos of what the space had looked like before I left for vacation. I explained that I was an environmental lawyer and that this wasn't just a simple property dispute. There were multiple legal and environmental violations involved. The officers, to their credit, quickly grasped the seriousness of the situation. They took statements from everyone present and documented the scene themselves. When Sarah tried to argue that this was just a civil matter, one of the officers pointed out that unauthorized construction and destruction of protected habitat could actually involve criminal charges. That seemed to finally crack Sarah's confident facade. But what about all the money we spent?" she stammered. "You can't just make us tear it all down." "Actually," I replied, "that's exactly what's going to happen. But first, we need to have environmental assessors document the damage to the protected habitat. And Sarah," I added, watching her face carefully, "you might want to check your homeowner's insurance policy. I have a feeling you're going to need it." One of the officers pulled me aside after taking my statement. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" I thought carefully before responding. "Not at this moment. I want to review all my options with my legal team first, but I would appreciate it if you could make sure your report includes all the environmental violations you've observed. The EPA and State Environmental Protection Office will need that documentation." As the officers finished their work and prepared to leave, I posted no trespassing signs around the perimeter of my property and began setting up temporary barriers around the playground. I could hear Sarah on her phone, presumably talking to someone about legal representation, her voice rising in panic as she finally began to realize the seriousness of her situation. What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. My measured, professional response to her unauthorized construction was about to open up a legal pathway that would make her wish she'd never even thought about building that playground. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic as the reality of her situation sank in. What started as confident defiance quickly devolved into a mix of desperate manipulation attempts and outright hostility. Her true colors weren't just showing, they were on full display for the entire neighborhood to see. The morning after our initial confrontation, I woke up to find Sarah had organized a playground protest in front of my house. She'd rallied several neighborhood parents and their children, complete with handmade signs reading "Save Our Playground" and "Nature versus Nurture, Choose Children." Some kids were even crying on cue for the local news crew she'd called. I watched from my security cameras as Sarah gave an emotional interview, tears streaming down her face as she explained how I was destroying the community and traumatizing the children. She'd carefully cultivated her appearance. No more yoga pants and designer tops. Instead, she wore a modest sundress and minimal makeup, playing the role of concerned mother perfectly. "He's always been difficult," I heard her tell the reporter, her voice trembling. "We tried so hard to work with him, to include him in the community. All we wanted was to create a safe space for our children to play. Is that so wrong?" What Sarah didn't realize was that her performance was actually helping my case. My security. Cameras were capturing everything, including her coaching the children on what to say to the reporters and orchestrating the most photogenic arrangements of crying kids. My lawyer was practically giddy when I sent her the footage. But Sarah's mask really slipped when the reporters left. I had stepped outside to water the plants in my front garden, carefully documenting the continued presence of protesters on my property for the pending legal case, when she stormed up to my property line. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed, all traces of the tearful mother gone. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. My cousin's husband is a judge. My sister works for the city council. We'll see how your precious conservation easement holds up when I'm done." I simply continued watering my plants. "That's interesting, Sarah. Would that be Judge Anderson? I actually worked with him on several environmental protection cases last year. Lovely man, very passionate about protecting conservation easements. As I recall." The color drained from her face, but she quickly rallied. "This isn't over. You know what? I'm glad this happened. Now everyone can see what kind of person you really are. You act all nice and neighborly, but you're just a selfish, bitter man who cares more about some stupid plants than about children." Just then, Tom came running over. "Sarah, stop! You're making things worse." He turned to me, looking desperate. "Please, can't we discuss this reasonably? Maybe come to some kind of compromise?" Before I could respond, Sarah whirled on him. "Compromise? There's nothing to compromise about. This is our playground. We paid for it. The kids love it. He's the one being unreasonable." "Actually," I interjected calmly, still watering my plants, "it's my playground since it's on my property and permanently attached to my land. That's basic property law. Speaking of which, how did you pay for it, Sarah? Did you use a home equity loan? Because I noticed a new lien on your property records yesterday." This seemed to strike a nerve. Sarah's face went from red to white and back again. "You've been investigating us," she shrieked. "That's harassment. I'm calling my lawyer." "Your lawyer should probably know about the environmental violations," I replied mildly. "The EPA inspector is coming tomorrow to assess the damage to the protected wetland. Did you know that willful destruction of protected habitat can carry criminal penalties?" That was when Sarah completely lost it. She grabbed the garden hose from my hands and turned it on me, screaming about how I was ruining everything. Tom tried to intervene, but ended up getting soaked himself. All of this, of course, was captured perfectly on my security cameras, providing yet more evidence of Sarah's deteriorating behavior. The neighborhood watch captain, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing from her porch across the street, finally called the police. When they arrived, Sarah tried to switch back to her tearful victim act, but it was too late. Too many people had witnessed her meltdown. As the police officers took statements, I could see the shift in the neighbors' expressions. The facade of the passionate community organizer had cracked, revealing the entitled, manipulative person. Beneath, even some of her previous supporters were quietly taking down their protest signs and slipping away. What Sarah failed to understand was that her true colors weren't just damaging her case legally. They were destroying the very community, support she'd worked so hard to build, and she had no idea that her biggest humiliation was still to come. The next few days brought an escalating series of incidents that showed just how far Sarah was willing to go to maintain control of her unauthorized playground. After her meltdown with the garden hose, you might think she would have backed down, or at least reconsidered her approach. Instead, she seemed to double down on her efforts to make my life difficult. First came the social media campaign. Sarah created a Facebook group called Save Our Community Playground and began sharing heavily edited clips from our confrontations. Of course, these clips conveniently left out her aggressive behavior and focused solely on moments where I was asking people to leave my property. She even posted the recording from our initial conversation, but cut it to make it sound like I had previously agreed to the playground construction. What she didn't expect was for several neighbors to post the full, unedited versions of these encounters in the comments. Mrs. Rodriguez, bless her heart, had recorded the entire garden hose incident on her phone and wasn't shy about sharing it. "Is this the kind of behavior we want to support in our community?" she wrote. "Assaulting a neighbor with a garden hose because he wants to protect legally protected wildlife." Then came the mysterious phone calls. My office started receiving dozens of calls each day from concerned parents, who all seemed to be reading from the same script about what a terrible person I was. My secretary, Jean, who's been with the firm for 20 years and can smell trouble a mile away, started keeping detailed logs of these calls. It didn't take long to trace many of them back to Sarah's close friends and family members. But things took a more serious turn when Sarah apparently decided that if she couldn't have the playground, she would destroy what was left of the habitat. I woke up one morning to find someone had poured what appeared to be weed killer all over the remaining native plants around the playground area. My security cameras had caught the whole thing. A figure in dark clothing, face covered, sneaking around at 3 a.m. with a sprayer. While I couldn't prove definitively it was Sarah in the video, the figure was wearing a distinctive pair of designer running shoes, the same ones Sarah had been bragging about at the last neighborhood barbecue. More importantly, the cameras caught the person returning to Sarah's house afterward. The EPA inspector, who had arrived to assess the original damage, was furious when he saw the additional destruction. "This is now moving beyond civil violations," he told me, shaking his head as he documented the dead and dying plants. "Willful destruction of protected habitat, especially after being notified of its protected status, can trigger criminal environmental charges." Sarah's response to the EPA investigation was to escalate further. She began organizing daily play-ins where she would bus in kids from other neighborhoods to protest on my property. She'd stand on her deck with a megaphone, leading them in chants about children's rights and community spaces. The noise violations alone were adding up, but she seemed beyond caring about legal consequences at this point. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Sarah attempted to file a claim of adverse possession on property she'd only been using for less than a month. Her lawsuit claimed that the community had been openly and continuously using my land for years, conveniently ignoring the fact that any previous use had been trespassing that I'd simply been too neighborly to pursue legally. I received a copy of her legal filing and had to admire the creative writing, if nothing else. She'd constructed an elaborate narrative about how I had verbally agreed to let the community use my land, how the playground was just a formalization of an existing arrangement, and how removing it would cause irreparable harm to the community's children. The filing included statements from several parents, obviously coached by Sarah, claiming they'd been using my property as a play area for years with my explicit permission. What Sarah didn't know was that many of these same parents had previously signed liability waivers when their kids participated in my authorized nature education programs, waivers that specifically acknowledged my property rights and the protected status of the habitat. Tom tried to intervene again, this time coming to my office directly. "She's not sleeping," he confided, looking exhausted himself. "She's up all night on Facebook, coordinating with her playground protection group, planning more protests. I tried to tell her that she's just making things worse, but she won't. Listen, she's convinced that if she can create enough public pressure, you'll have to give in. What neither Sarah nor Tom realized was that each new escalation, each desperate attempt to force her way, was actually strengthening my legal position. Every protest, every social media post, every attempted intimidation tactic was being carefully documented, building an irrefutable case of harassment and malicious intent. But the real turning point was about to come from an unexpected direction. One that would finally show Sarah just how badly she had miscalculated. After about a week of constant protests and social media warfare, things suddenly went quiet. The daily play-ins stopped. The angry phone calls to my office ceased. Sarah's Facebook group hadn't had any new posts for several days. Even Sarah herself seemed to have retreated, no longer standing on her deck with her megaphone or organizing protests. To most people, it might have looked like she'd finally come to her senses and given up. But I knew better. In my years of environmental law practice, I'd seen this pattern before, the calm before the storm, when opposing parties retreat to plan something big. Still, I had to admit the quiet was nice. I used the respite to continue building my case, meeting with various experts to document the damage. The EPA inspector had completed his initial report, which detailed numerous violations of federal environmental protection laws. The local conservation trust sent their own specialist to assess the breach of the conservation easement. Even the city's zoning board had gotten involved, as the playground violated several municipal codes. I noticed Tom spending more time than usual in their garage, often late into the night. The lights would be on, and I could hear what sounded like power tools and construction noise. Through my kitchen window, I observed numerous deliveries being made to their house, large boxes and construction materials, all delivered after normal. Business hours, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had appointed herself my unofficial neighborhood watchdog, reported seeing unfamiliar cars parked outside Sarah's house late at night. "They're having meetings," she told me over the fence one morning. "Lots of people coming and going. That woman is planning something, mark my words." I marked her words, indeed, making sure my security cameras were recording every unusual vehicle and late-night visitor. I also noticed Sarah had started being oddly nice to other neighbors, hosting coffee mornings and what appeared to be planning meetings in her living room. Through the grapevine, I heard she was telling people that she had found a solution and that everything would be resolved soon. During this quiet period, I received an unexpected visit from the playground construction company's lawyer. He was surprisingly forthcoming, explaining that Sarah had misrepresented the situation to them, claiming she had written permission to build on the property. They were eager to distance themselves from the situation and offered to provide all documentation related to the project, including Sarah's original communications with them. "Our company has a reputation to protect," he explained, sliding a folder across my desk. "We've never been involved in anything like this before, and we want to make it clear that we acted in good faith based on Mrs. Harrison's representations." The documents he provided were illuminating. Sarah had actually begun planning this project months ago, long before I'd announced my vacation. She'd gotten quotes from multiple companies, and her emails showed a clear pattern of deception. She'd even created a fake email address in my name to send approval for the project, though thankfully the construction company had been wise enough to keep records of the IP addresses those emails came from. One afternoon, during this deceptively quiet period, I was working in my home office when I heard children's laughter from the direction of the playground. Looking out, I saw Sarah leading what appeared to be a photography session. She had arranged a group of children on the playground equipment while a professional photographer took pictures. The children were all wearing matching T-shirts with some kind of logo I couldn't quite make out. Tom was there too, looking uncomfortable as usual, but helping to organize the kids for photos. I noticed he kept checking his phone and glancing nervously in the direction of my house. Whatever Sarah was planning, it was clear Tom was worried about it. I considered going out to stop the photo shoot, as they were still trespassing on my property, but my instincts told me to wait and watch. This felt staged, like Sarah was deliberately trying to create specific images for some purpose. I made sure my cameras were recording everything and continued observing. Later that evening, I received an cryptic email from an anonymous account. You might want to check tomorrow's local newspaper and the city council meeting agenda. The email came from a domain associated with the city government, suggesting someone on the inside was trying to warn me. I spent that night reviewing all my documentation, making sure everything was in order. Years of legal practice had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming that Sarah's apparent retreat wasn't a surrender. It was preparation for something bigger. As I would soon discover, I was right to be suspicious. Sarah had indeed been busy during this quiet period, and her next move would prove to be her most ambitious, and ultimately her most disastrous yet. 12. The anonymous tip about checking the newspaper proved to be crucial. The next morning's edition of the Cedar Grove Gazette featured a full-page advertisement announcing the grand opening celebration of Harrison Community Park, complete with those professional photos Sarah had staged the day before. The ad invited the entire community to a ribbon-cutting ceremony that weekend, promising face painting, food trucks, and special announcements from city officials. But it was the city council meeting agenda that really caught my attention. Hidden among routine items was a proposal to discuss the potential exercise of eminent domain for the creation of a public recreational space. The location listed matched my property coordinates exactly, so that was Sarah's big play. She was trying to get the city to forcibly take my land for public use. The photos, the community events, the sudden quieting of protests, it was all part of a calculated strategy to present the playground as an established community resource that justified government intervention. Time to put my own preparations into high gear. First, I called an emergency meeting with my firm's legal team. We'd anticipated something like this might happen and had already prepared counter-arguments, but now we needed to refine our strategy. I brought in our top eminent domain specialist, Maria Chen, who had successfully fought similar cases before. They're overreaching, Maria said, reviewing the council agenda. Eminent domain requires proving public necessity and fair compensation. They can't just take private property because some neighbors want a playground, especially not when there's an existing public park less than a mile away. Next, I contacted Dr. James Wilson, the leading expert on urban wildlife corridors in our state. He'd been documenting the importance of my property as a crucial link in the regional ecosystem. I can have a full report ready before the council meeting, he assured me, complete with data showing the negative impact the playground has already had on local wildlife populations. I also reached out to the conservation trust that held my property easement. They were, to put it mildly, not happy about Sarah's attempt to circumvent their legal protections. We'll have our legal team at the council meeting, their director promised. This kind of precedent could threaten conservation easements across the state. We're not about to let that happen. The EPA inspector who had documented the environmental violations proved to be another valuable ally. When I told him about the eminent domain attempt, he fast-tracked his report and even offered to speak at the council meeting about the federal environmental regulations that would be violated by converting the protected habitat into a public park. But my most important preparation involved the community itself. Mrs. Rodriguez had been keeping me informed about Sarah's efforts to rally support among the neighbors. Now it was time to present our side of the story. I organized a small information session in my living room, inviting key neighborhood figures to learn about the property's environmental significance and the legal issues involved. I understand the desire for a community playground, I told the gathered neighbors, many of whom had previously supported Sarah. That's why I've been working on a proper plan for a natural play area that would serve both recreational and educational purposes. I shared the preliminary designs I'd been developing with the educational non-profit, plans that had been interrupted by Sarah's unauthorized construction. The reaction was illuminating. Many neighbors who had initially bought into Sarah's narrative about me being anti-children began to see the situation differently. The fact that I had actually been working on a legal, environmentally conscious solution impressed them, especially when contrasted with Sarah's deceptive approach. I also made sure to document everything meticulously. Every email, every photo, every piece of evidence was carefully organized and backed up. I had learned early in my legal career that cases are often won or lost based on documentation, and I wasn't taking any chances. The night before the council meeting, I received another anonymous email. Sarah's been meeting with Councilman Parker, privately, claims to have 500 signatures on a petition supporting the playground. Thought you should know. This was followed by surveillance camera footage from City Hall showing Sarah entering Parker's office after hours. Perfect. The evidence of private meetings with council members would be useful if we needed to challenge the impartiality of the decision-making process. I added it to our growing file. As I finished my preparations late that night, I noticed lights still on in Sarah's house. Through my security cameras, I could see people coming and going, carrying poster boards and what looked like presentation materials. Sarah was clearly preparing for a show at tomorrow's council meeting. What she didn't realize was that her dramatic public performance was about to run headlong into a wall of carefully prepared legal and scientific evidence. Sometimes the best defense isn't just being right, it's being right with documentation to prove it. The city council meeting was set for 7 p.m., but by 6:15, the chamber was already packed. Sarah had mobilized her supporters effectively. Dozens of parents wearing matching Save Our Playground t-shirts filled the front rows, many with children in tow. Professional-looking posters lined the walls, showing happy kids playing on the equipment, carefully edited to remove any sign of the environmental damage surrounding it. I noticed a local news crew setting up their equipment. Sarah was giving them a pre-meeting interview, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she undoubtedly recounted her version of events. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, the concerned mother fighting for her community against the mean environmental lawyer who wanted to destroy children's happiness. Tom sat in the back, looking increasingly uncomfortable as more people filed in. When our eyes met briefly, he quickly looked away. I'd heard through the grapevine that he'd mortgaged their house to pay for the playground construction, not knowing it had been built illegally. His financial future was now tied to the outcome of tonight's meeting. At exactly 7 p.m., Council President Martinez called the meeting to order. The playground issue had been moved to the top of the agenda due to the large turnout. Sarah had clearly planned this well. The first hour was dedicated to public comments from her supporters. One by one, they approached the podium with carefully rehearsed speeches. A local pediatrician talked about the importance of outdoor play for child development. The PTA president discussed the lack of recreational spaces in the neighborhood. Parents shared heartwarming stories about their children making friends at the playground. Then came Sarah's masterstroke. She brought up a group of children, including her own, to sing a song they'd prepared about saving their playground. Several council members were visibly moved, and I could see Councilman Parker, who Sarah had met with privately, nodding along approvingly. When it was finally time for the opposition to speak, I led with our expert witnesses. Dr. Wilson presented, His findings on the wildlife corridor, complete with before and after photos showing the environmental damage. The EPA inspector detailed the numerous federal violations. The Conservation Trust's lawyer explained how allowing the eminent domain claim would set a dangerous precedent for protected lands everywhere. But the turning point came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez had been doing some investigation of her own, and what she discovered changed everything. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium carrying a thick folder. "Before you consider this eminent domain request," she began, "you should know about the private playground company that Mrs. Harrison has registered." She proceeded to share documents showing that Sarah had created an LLC called Harrison Community Playgrounds just weeks before building the structure. The company's business plan, which Mrs. Rodriguez had somehow obtained, revealed Sarah's true intentions. The playground wasn't meant to be a free community resource. It was intended to be a private membership-based play space. The maintenance fees Sarah had mentioned were actually meant to be monthly membership dues, with her company controlling access and collecting the payments. She had even drafted liability waivers that would have made my insurance responsible. While her company kept the profits, the council chamber erupted in murmurs. Parents who had supported Sarah began whispering among themselves, many looking shocked and betrayed. Sarah jumped up, trying to grab the microphone to explain, but Council President Martinez gavelled her down. That's when Tom finally broke his silence. Standing up in the back of the room, he called out, "It's all true. She forged my signature on the LLC paperwork. I only found out when the bank called about the business loan she'd taken out in our names." Sarah spun around, face flushed, with anger. "Shut up, Tom. You're ruining everything." The council chamber descended into chaos. Parents who had paid for founding memberships in what they thought was a community project began demanding answers. The news crew was catching everything on camera. Sarah's carefully orchestrated performance had completely unraveled. Council President Martinez had to call a 15-minute recess to restore order. During the break, I watched as Sarah's supporters, one by one, removed their Save Our Playground t-shirts and left the chamber. By the time the meeting resumed, the room had notably emptied. When the council finally voted, it was unanimous. The eminent domain request was denied, and Sarah's company was referred to the district attorney's office for investigation of fraud. Furthermore, the council issued an emergency order requiring the immediate removal of the playground equipment and restoration of the protected habitat. As the meeting adjourned, Sarah sat alone in her chair, staring blankly ahead as her elaborate scheme crumbled around her. But even then, I knew this wasn't over. The look in her eyes told me she had one more desperate move left to make. The day after the city council meeting, my phone started ringing non-stop with calls from people wanting to share information about Sarah's previous schemes. It seemed the playground incident had opened a floodgate of revelations from people who had stayed quiet until now. The most interesting call came from Linda Peterson, who had sold Sarah and Tom their house 3 years ago. She had been watching the local news coverage of the council meeting and felt compelled to reach out. "I need to tell you about something that happened during the sale," Linda said, her voice tense. "Sarah tried to pull a similar stunt with us. Before closing, she had a construction company come out to measure our backyard, your current neighbor's yard. When we asked what it was for, she claimed she was just planning a simple garden, but one of the workers accidentally left behind some blueprints." Linda went on to explain that the blueprints had shown plans for a large swimming pool and outdoor entertainment area that would have extended well beyond the property line into what was then Mr. Thompson's land, my current property. She actually tried to argue that since the plans were drawn up, we had to disclose them to Mr. Thompson as part of the sale, like somehow her unauthorized plans created an obligation on our part. Throughout the day, more neighbors came forward with their own stories. Mrs. Rodriguez organized an impromptu community meeting in her living room, where people felt safe sharing their experiences with Sarah's manipulative behavior. Jenny, from 2 doors down, revealed that Sarah had tried to convince her to sign a petition last year to have the neighborhood's protected oak trees removed, claiming they were dangerous to children. The petition had failed when the city arborist confirmed the trees were perfectly healthy. Mike, whose kids had been featured in Sarah's playground photos, was furious to learn that she had used the pictures in marketing materials for her private playground company without his permission. "She told us it was for a community newsletter," he fumed. "My kids' faces are all over her business plan." But the most damning perspective came from Rebecca, who had served with Sarah on the PTA board at the elementary school. She arrived at Mrs. Rodriguez's house carrying a thick binder of documents. "Sarah was our treasurer last year," Rebecca explained, spreading papers across the coffee table. "We had to ask her to step down when we discovered discrepancies in the accounts. Nothing we could prove definitively. She always had explanations for why money had been moved around, but things never quite added up." Rebecca had kept detailed records of all the financial irregularities, along with emails showing Sarah's pattern of manipulating other board members. She would pit people against each other, always positioning herself as the reasonable one trying to keep the peace. When things went wrong, she always had someone else to blame. Even Sarah's close friends were starting to distance themselves. Karen, who had been one of her most vocal supporters at the council meeting, stopped by my house to apologize. "We all bought into her story because she made it sound so reasonable at first," Karen admitted. "Just a group of mums wanting to create something nice for the community. She never told us about the business plan or the membership fees. We thought we were supporting a public playground, not a private enterprise." The local media was having a field day with the revelations. A reporter from the Cedar Grove Gazette interviewed several contractors who had worked on the playground installation. They described how Sarah had pressured them to work through weekends and nights to complete the project before I returned from vacation, paying cash bonuses for speed and discretion. The playground company's employees shared their own perspectives. The sales representative who had worked with Sarah came forward with recordings of their meetings, standard practice for their contract discussions. In them, Sarah could be clearly heard claiming she had written authorization from the property owner, even providing a forged document with what she claimed was my signature. Tom's sister Jane, who lived in the next town over, reached out through my law firm. She shared years' worth of text messages showing Sarah's long-term obsession with my property. "She would send photos of your yard to Tom constantly," Jane explained, always commenting on how wasted the space was, how she could put it to better use. She had this whole playground scheme planned before they even closed on their house. The most poignant perspective came from Tom himself. He came to my office, looking exhausted and carrying a manila envelope. "I found these in Sarah's home office," he said, sliding out a stack of papers. "She's been documenting your schedule for months, noting when you left for work, when you returned, any patterns in your routine. She specifically planned the construction for when you'd be out of the country, because she knew it was your longest absence from the property in 7 years. The outside perspectives were building a clear picture of Sarah's calculated long-term manipulation of everyone around her. But even as these revelations were coming to light, Sarah was already setting in motion her final, desperate plan. The morning after all these revelations came to light, I received an unexpected call from the playground construction company's CEO himself. He had flown in personally to deal with the situation after seeing the local news coverage. "We've completed our internal investigation," he explained, "and what we've found is disturbing. I'd like to meet with you and share our findings. This goes beyond just your property." 2 hours later, I sat in my office conference room with the CEO, Mr. Davidson, as he laid out a devastating trail of evidence. His company had compiled everything into a comprehensive digital forensics report. When Mrs. Harrison first contacted us, he began, pulling up emails on his laptop. She used an email address designed to look like it came from your law firm. Our IT team traced it to an account created specifically for this project. He turned the screen toward me, showing dozens of emails where Sarah had impersonated both me and my firm. But that was just the beginning. The company's payment records revealed something even more sinister. Sarah had actually set up 2 contracts for the playground. One official contract showing a modest community playground, which she'd shown to Tom and used to get the home equity loan, and a second, much more extensive contract that included features clearly intended for a commercial operation. She paid the difference in cash, Mr. Davidson explained, spreading out bank records, almost $100,000 beyond the official contract price. When our accountants flagged it for review, she provided documentation claiming it was backed by community donations. We now know those documents were forged. The evidence kept mounting. The company's site surveys required for all their installations showed that Sarah had deliberately misrepresented the property boundaries. She had provided them with altered property maps that made it appear as though the construction site was part of her land. "This is the original site survey," Mr. Davidson said, pulling out a large rolled document. "And this," he continued, unrolling, "another, is the version Mrs. Harrison submitted to us. Notice the property lines. They've been digitally modified." The company's security cameras had captured Sarah's late-night visits to their office, where she had apparently charmed a junior employee into giving her access to the building plans. The footage showed her taking photos of the technical drawings and making notes, but the most damning evidence came from Sarah's own meticulous planning. The company had retained copies of every document she'd submitted, including a detailed business plan for Harrison Community Playgrounds, LLC, that laid out her entire scheme. The plan revealed that the playground on my property was meant to be just the first of several similar installations. Sarah had already identified other potential locations, all private properties with large, undeveloped lots. She had even drafted letters to those property owners, planning to use the success of this first playground as leverage to convince them to donate their land to her enterprise. This wasn't just about building a playground, Mr. Davidson concluded. Mrs. Harrison was attempting to create an entire network of private play spaces, using manipulated community support to essentially appropriate private property for her commercial venture. The company provided me with a complete copy of their findings, including all email correspondence with Sarah, payment records and bank statements, security camera footage, original and altered property documents, site surveys and construction plans, copies of both contracts, internal communication records, employee statements, technical specifications showing the commercial nature of the installation. They also gave me something unexpected: a flash drive containing backup copies of all the digital communications Sarah thought she had deleted from their servers. "We maintain encrypted backups of all project communications," Mr. Davidson explained. "Mrs. Harrison apparently tried to hack into our system last week to delete her tracks, but she only accessed the front-end servers. Everything was preserved in our secure backup system." The flash drive contained hundreds of messages where Sarah had explicitly discussed her plans to use the playground as leverage for her business venture. She had even created detailed contingency plans for different scenarios, including what to do if I discovered the construction before it was complete. As Mr. Davidson prepared to leave, he handed me one final document, a notarized statement from his company taking full responsibility for failing to properly verify property ownership, and offering to cover all costs associated with removing the playground and restoring the habitat. "We've never had anything like this happen in our company's 30-year history," he said gravely. "We want to make this right." This comprehensive evidence would prove crucial in the legal proceedings to come, but at that moment, I had no idea that Sarah was about to make one final desperate move that would make all of this proof even more important. The morning after my meeting with Mr. Davidson, I arrived at my office to find Detective Martinez from the county's Financial Crimes Unit waiting for me. It turned out that Sarah's playground scheme had caught the attention of law enforcement. For reasons beyond just the property violation, we've been investigating a series of suspicious LLC formations in the county, Detective Martinez explained, setting down a thick case file. Mrs. Harrison's playground company raised several red flags. We've discovered she's created multiple shell companies over the past year, all following a similar pattern. The detective spread out documents showing at least 5 different companies Sarah had established, each with a slightly different variation of community enrichment purposes. Each one had been set up using a different combination of forged signatures and misleading documentation. What really caught our attention, Detective Martinez continued, was the money trail. Mrs. Harrison has been soliciting community investment for these ventures, promising returns from future membership fees. We've identified over 30 people who invested amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000. As we talked, more officials began arriving at my office. The EPA had escalated their investigation to their Criminal Enforcement Division due to the deliberate destruction of protected habitat. The State Attorney General's office had opened an investigation into the fraudulent business practices. Even the FBI had taken an interest due to the potential wire fraud implications of Sarah's online payment collection system for playground memberships. "We're executing search warrants on all of Mrs. Harrison's properties today," Detective Martinez informed me, "including her home office and storage units we've identified in her name. We have reason to believe she's been running this type of scheme before in other communities." Just then my phone buzzed with a news alert. The local station was running a breaking story. Sarah had been spotted that morning attempting to remove documents from a storage facility on the outskirts of town. When confronted by police, she had locked herself inside the storage unit. "That would be our team," Detective Martinez said, checking her phone. "We had surveillance on all her known locations. We knew she'd try something like this once she realized we were investigating. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. The authorities had discovered that Sarah's scheme went far beyond just my property. She had been running various community improvement scams across 3 different counties, using the same basic playbook. Identify desirable private property, create community pressure for improvements, and then monetize access to these unauthorized installations. The district attorney's office set up a command center in their financial crimes division to coordinate the multiple investigations. I watched as box after box of evidence was brought in: financial records, forged documents, marketing materials for planned community ventures, and even architectural plans for future unauthorized construction projects. Mrs. Harrison appears to have been planning this type of operation for years, the DA's investigator told me, showing me a timeline they'd constructed. Your property was meant to be her proof of concept. If she had succeeded here, she had plans to replicate this model across the state. The investigation revealed that Sarah had even created a fake environmental consulting firm to produce counterfeit habitat assessments, which she planned to use to challenge conservation easements on other properties she had targeted. By late afternoon, the situation at the storage facility had been resolved. Sarah had finally emerged, but not before attempting to destroy documents by setting them on fire. adding attempted destruction of evidence to her growing list of charges. The authorities had managed to salvage most of the documents, which provided even more evidence of the scope of her schemes. They found detailed dossiers on multiple property owners, including surveillance photos, schedule notes, and strategies for manipulating community opinion against them. "We're looking at multiple felony counts," the DA's investigator explained. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, document forgery, securities fraud for the illegal investment scheme, criminal environmental violations, and now attempted destruction of evidence. The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing the case for potential federal charges as well." Tom had been brought in for questioning, but was quickly cleared of involvement. He provided investigators with full access to their home computers and financial records, helping to establish that he had been kept in the dark about most of Sarah's activities. As the day drew to a close, Detective Martinez returned to my office with one final piece of information. "We found something in the partially burned documents that you should know about," she said, looking troubled. "Mrs. Harrison had plans for what she called a nuclear option if her playground scheme failed. Based on what we've found, we believe she may attempt to implement this plan within the next 24 hours. The detective wouldn't provide specifics, but advised me to be on high alert. We're maintaining surveillance on her, but she's proven quite resourceful at evading detection. Whatever she's planning, she's likely to make her move soon." Detective Martinez's warning proved prophetic. At 3 a.m. that night, my security system's silent alarm triggered, sending an alert to my phone. The camera feed showed a familiar figure, moving through my property, heading not toward the playground, but toward the protected wetland area beyond it. I immediately called Detective Martinez while pulling up the live security feed on my laptop. Sarah was dressed in dark clothing and carrying what looked like several large containers. She was moving with purpose, clearly familiar with the property's layout despite the darkness. "Stay inside and maintain visual contact," Detective Martinez instructed. "We have plainclothes officers in the area. We want to catch her in the act." Through the infrared cameras, I watched as Sarah began pouring something from the containers along the edge of the wetland. The realization hit me immediately. She was trying to destroy the protected habitat completely, probably hoping to eliminate the environmental protection that had been such a crucial part of the legal case against her. But Sarah had made one crucial mistake. In her rush to execute her nuclear option, she'd forgotten about the wildlife cameras I'd installed throughout the property. These motion-activated cameras were catching everything in crystal-clear detail, including the labels on the containers she was carrying. I could hear sirens in the distance, but they were still too far away. Sarah was working quickly, already emptying her second container. Whatever she was using would cause irreparable damage to the delicate ecosystem if it reached the water table. That's when I made a decision that my lawyers would later strongly disapprove of. I decided to confront her directly. Grabbing my phone, to maintain video evidence, I turned on my property's floodlights and stepped outside. "It's over, Sarah," I called out, causing her to freeze mid-pour. "The police are on their way, and everything you're doing is being recorded." She straightened up slowly, and when she turned to face me, her expression was chilling. Gone was the carefully crafted mask of the concerned community mother. In its place was something hard and calculating. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" she snarled, dropping the empty container. "You and your precious wildlife. Do you know how much money I've lost because of you? Do you have any idea what you've ruined?" "I think the DA's office has a pretty good idea," I replied, keeping my distance but maintaining eye contact. "They found your storage unit today. All your plans, all your schemes, they know everything." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Those weren't even my good files. You think this is my first time dealing with nosy neighbors and their property rights? I've been running these operations for years. Different names, different cities, but always the same basic story. People like you are all the same. sitting on valuable land, protecting it while children have nowhere to play, and charging membership fees to access stolen property. That's your solution. I kept her talking, aware of movement in the shadows, as police officers quietly took up positions around us. It's called business opportunity, she spat. Nobody gets hurt. The community gets their playground. I make a profit, and people like you learn to share. But you, she grabbed another container, you had to play the hero, had to get everyone involved. Well, if I'm going down, I'm taking your precious habitat with me. She unscrewed the cap, but before she could pour, a voice boomed out. Police! Drop the container and put your hands up. Suddenly the property was flooded with light as police vehicles revealed their positions. Sarah looked around wildly, then made one last desperate move. She threw the container directly at me. I managed to dodge, but some of the liquid splashed onto my arm, immediately causing a burning sensation. The police tackled Sarah as she tried to run, while hazmat teams that had been standing by rushed in to contain the chemicals. Later analysis would reveal she had been using a highly toxic herbicide mixture that would have destroyed decades of ecological development. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time. "You'll see," she shouted. "Next time, I'll be smarter. Next time, there won't be a next time, Mrs. Harrison," Detective Martinez interrupted, reading from a document. "We've just received confirmation of federal indictments. You're looking at multiple felony counts across 3 states. I watched as Sarah was placed in a police car, her face finally showing the first traces of real fear. The detective walked over to me, shaking her head. "The hazmat team needs to check you out," she said, gesturing to my arm where the chemical had splashed. "But first, there's something you should know about what we found in those storage unit files. This isn't quite over yet." The legal consequences for Sarah unfolded over the next several months, revealing the true scope of her activities. The preliminary hearing alone took 3 days, as prosecutor after prosecutor from different jurisdictions presented evidence of her various schemes. The files recovered from her storage unit had blown the case wide open. Sarah hadn't just been planning playground schemes, she had been running similar operations across 3 states for the past 5 years. She would move into a new community, identify vulnerable properties, and then manipulate local sentiment to pressure property owners into allowing community improvements that she would then monetize. The district attorney's office identified at least 7 other properties where Sarah had successfully implemented versions of her scheme. In each case, she had followed the same basic playbook: create a shell company, rally community support, install unauthorized structures, and then charge for access while making the original property owners appear as villains if they objected. "The level of premeditation is staggering," the judge commented during sentencing. "Mrs. Harrison, you have demonstrated a pattern of calculated fraud that has not only violated property rights, but has also caused significant environmental damage and betrayed community trust." The final tally of charges was overwhelming. Multiple counts of wire fraud and mail fraud, criminal environmental violations, forgery and document falsification, operating fraudulent business enterprises, criminal trespassing and property damage, attempted destruction of evidence, securities fraud for the illegal investment scheme, and finally, attempted destruction of protected habitat with toxic substances. The sentence came down hard: 15 years in federal prison plus additional state charges to be served concurrently. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all her victims, including the full cost of removing the playground and restoring my property's habitat. But the consequences weren't limited to Sarah. The investigation had revealed that several local officials had been complicit in her schemes, either through active participation or willful negligence. Councilman Parker resigned in disgrace when emails emerged showing he had accepted payments from Sarah in exchange for supporting her eminent domain proposal. The playground construction company, despite their cooperation with the investigation, faced significant penalties for failing to properly verify property ownership. They ultimately settled with me out of court, agreeing to handle the complete restoration of the habitat under the supervision of environmental experts. Tom filed for divorce, while Sarah was in custody awaiting trial. During the divorce proceedings, even more details emerged about the extent of her deceptions. She had secretly remortgaged their house multiple times to fund her schemes, forging Tom's signature on the documents. He was left financially devastated. Though the court did allow him to maintain custody of their children, the community itself went through a period of profound reflection. Many neighbors who had supported Sarah's playground project were forced to confront their own roles in enabling her behavior. The Save Our Playground Facebook group transformed into a community discussion forum about property rights and environmental conservation. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a neighborhood meeting to address the fallout. "We need to learn from this," she told the gathered residents. "We let ourselves be manipulated because we wanted to believe in an easy solution. But real community building doesn't come from stealing and destroying. It comes from working together honestly." The environmental consequences of Sarah's actions would take longer to address. The EPA's final assessment revealed that her nuclear option attempt had contaminated a significant portion of the wetland soil. The cleanup and restoration process would take years, though the Conservation Trust pledged to use the case as an opportunity to educate the public about the importance of protecting natural habitats. Perhaps the most lasting consequence was the legal precedent set by the case. The state legislature used the incident as impetus to pass stronger protections for conservation easements and increased penalties for environmental vandalism. Several other states began examining their own laws regarding unauthorized construction on private property. As for me, I decided to turn the experience into something positive. Working with the educational nonprofit I'd originally planned to partner with, I developed a program to teach children about environmental conservation and property rights. We created a natural playground on a different part of my property, one properly permitted and designed to coexist with the local ecosystem. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when the program won a Community Service Award 6 months later. The local paper's headline read, "From Controversy to Conservation, How One Property Dispute Led to Environmental Education Program." Sarah's final attempted contact came in the form of a letter from prison. "You think you've won," she wrote, "but there will always be people like me, finding ways to take what others won't share. That's just business." I filed the letter away with the rest of the case documentation, a reminder that sometimes the highest price of protecting what's right is eternal vigilance. The security cameras stayed up, the legal documents remained carefully organized, and the restored wetland continued its slow recovery, now with added legal protections, ensuring its preservation for future generations. In the year following Sarah's sentencing, our neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The whole experience had sparked a genuine interest in community building, but this time done the right way. The aftermath of Sarah's schemes actually brought people together in ways her forced community improvements never could. The first major change came in how the neighborhood handled property disputes. The Homeowners Association, which had previously been rather passive, established clear guidelines for community projects. Any proposed changes that might affect multiple properties now required transparent documentation, proper permits, and most importantly, genuine community dialogue. Tom and his children stayed in the neighborhood, though they moved to a smaller house they could afford after the financial devastation Sarah had caused. The community rallied around them in unexpected ways. Neighbors helped with the move, organized meal trains, and even set up a college fund for the kids. It was as if everyone wanted to prove that real community support didn't need elaborate schemes or stolen property, just genuine care for one's neighbors. The space where the illegal playground had stood underwent its own transformation. The restoration process, funded by the construction company's settlement, became an ongoing educational opportunity. Local schools brought students to observe the rehabilitation of the wetland habitat, learning firsthand about ecosystem recovery and environmental protection. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had emerged as an unexpected community leader through the whole ordeal, started a neighborhood watch program with a twist. Instead of just looking out for criminal activity, they focused on identifying opportunities for legitimate community improvement. When they discovered that some elderly residents struggled to maintain their yards, they organized volunteer landscaping days. When parents mentioned wanting a play area for kids, they worked with the city to renovate an existing public park. The irony, Mrs. Rodriguez often said, is that we're doing now what Sarah claimed she wanted to do, building community. We just learned to do it with respect for each other's rights and property. The educational program I'd developed continued to grow. We partnered with local schools to create an environmental education curriculum that used my property as a living laboratory. Kids who might once have played on Sarah's illegal playground were now learning about native species, conducting water quality tests in the restored wetland, and understanding why conservation matters. One unexpected development came from the construction company involved in the original playground installation. After paying for the habitat restoration, they completely reformed their verification processes. They even created a scholarship program for environmental law students, citing the incident as a wake-up call for their industry about the importance of proper due diligence. The legal community took notice too. Several law schools in the state added the case to their property law curriculum, using it as a study in how environmental protection, property rights, and community interests intersect. I was invited to give guest lectures, sharing not just the legal aspects, but the human lessons learned from the experience. Councilman Parker's resignation led to special elections, and the new council member turned out to be none other than Tom. His first-hand experience with Sarah's manipulation made him a strong advocate for transparency in community development. He worked to establish a community advisory board that brought together property owners, environmental experts, and neighborhood representatives to evaluate proposed projects. The wildlife returned to the restored habitat gradually. First came the insects and small animals, then the birds began nesting again. The motion-activated cameras that had caught Sarah's crimes now captured more positive images. Foxes teaching their kits to hunt, deer grazing in the early morning, even a pair of endangered owls making their home in the recovered wetland. Perhaps the most meaningful change was in how the neighborhood children related to the space. Instead of seeing it as just empty land that should be a playground, they began to appreciate it as a living ecosystem. The natural play area we eventually created became more popular than Sarah's playground ever was, precisely because it worked with the environment rather than against it. Even the local real estate market felt the effects. Properties in our neighborhood actually increased in value, not because of unauthorized playgrounds, but because the area became known for its strong community bonds and commitment to environmental preservation. Real estate listings proudly mentioned proximity to the educational nature preserve my property had become. Sarah's nuclear option had ironically led to exactly what she claimed to want, a more valuable, more connected community. Just not in the way she had intended. The toxic chemicals she had tried to use to destroy the wetland had instead sparked a chain of events that made the neighborhood stronger and more united than ever. One day, About a year after everything had settled, I found a small package on my doorstep. Inside was a handmade bird feeder and a note from one of the neighborhood kids who had once played on Sarah's playground. "Thank you for teaching us about the animals," it read. "I like this better than the old playground. It's more real." That bird feeder still hangs in my yard today, a reminder that sometimes the best community improvements aren't built with metal and plastic, but with understanding, respect, and genuine care for both people and nature. Looking back on everything that happened with Sarah and the playground incident, I've come to understand some fundamental truths about property rights, community, and human nature. The experience taught me lessons that went far beyond just legal precedents or environmental protection. The first and perhaps most important lesson was about the true meaning of community. Sarah had repeatedly used the word community as a weapon, wielding it to justify her actions and manipulate others. But real community, as we discovered in the aftermath, isn't built through force or deception. It grows naturally through respect, understanding, and genuine cooperation. I remember sitting in my restored wetland area one evening, watching families participate in our nature education program when it really hit me. The children were excitedly identifying different bird species, parents were helping to maintain the native plant gardens, and neighbors were chatting as they walked the nature trails we'd created. This was genuine community building, people coming together voluntarily to create something meaningful. Another crucial lesson came from observing how Sarah's scheme had almost succeeded. She had understood something important about human nature, people's desire to belong and to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. She had exploited this natural inclination, using it to turn neighbors against each other and justify her illegal actions. But what she failed to understand was that the same desire for connection that made her manipulation possible could also be channeled into legitimate community improvement. The very people she had tried to use as pawns in her scheme were now leading genuine initiatives to make our neighborhood better, all while respecting property rights and environmental protections. The experience also taught me about the importance of documentation and vigilance. My habit of keeping detailed records, installing security cameras, and maintaining clear boundaries had seemed excessive to some neighbors at first. But when Sarah's schemes came to light, these precautions proved crucial in protecting not just my property, but the entire community from her fraudulent activities. Perhaps the most profound lesson came from watching how the children in our neighborhood adapted to the changes. Initially, many had been disappointed when the playground was removed, but as they became involved in the environmental education program, their perspective shifted. They learned to see value in preservation, in understanding the natural world around them, and in being part of something sustainable and real. One conversation with a young participant in our program particularly stood out. "The playground was fun," she told me, "but it was just a thing. This is alive. We're helping take care of it, and it takes care of us too." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say, the legal battle had also taught me something about patience and persistence. It would have been easier to give in to Sarah's demands initially, to avoid the conflict and let her have her way. But standing firm, despite the pressure and manipulation, ultimately led to a better outcome for everyone, even those who had initially opposed me. Tom's transformation from Sarah's unwitting accomplice to community leader showed how people can grow from their mistakes when given the chance. His experience had made him a powerful advocate for transparency and proper procedure in community development. "Sometimes," he once told me, "you have to learn the hard way what not to do before you can understand how to do things right." The environmental lessons were equally significant. Sarah's attempt to destroy the wetland had paradoxically led to its stronger protection and greater appreciation. People who had once seen the space as empty or wasted now understood its vital role in our local ecosystem. The incident had turned abstract concepts like conservation and habitat protection into tangible realities that the community could see and understand. Mrs. Rodriguez summed it up well during one of our neighborhood meetings. We learned that you can't build community by destroying what others have built. Real progress comes from working together, respecting boundaries, and finding solutions that benefit everyone without harming anyone. The whole experience had also taught me about the power of turning negative situations into positive opportunities. Instead of just fighting Sarah's illegal playground, we had created something better, an educational program that benefited the community while preserving the environment. The very conflict that could have torn our neighborhood apart had ultimately brought it closer together. As I watch the restored wetland continue to thrive, hosting school groups and community events, I'm reminded that sometimes the best things grow from the most challenging situations. Sarah's attempt to force her vision of community onto others had failed, but in its place, something more authentic and valuable had emerged. A genuine understanding of what it means to be good neighbors and responsible stewards of both property and nature. The final lesson was perhaps the simplest but most important. Doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, usually leads to the best outcomes in the long run. Standing up to Sarah's manipulation and illegal actions hadn't been easy, but it had paved the way for real positive change in our community. If you're watching this video and dealing with entitled neighbors or property disputes of your own, I hope my story provides some useful insights. While not everyone will face someone as extreme as Sarah, the basic principles I learned can apply to many situations. First, always document everything. Those security cameras and detailed records that I kept might have seemed excessive at first, but they proved invaluable when things escalated. In today's world, having clear evidence of what happens on your property isn't paranoid, it's prudent. Second, know your rights, but also understand your responsibilities. As a property owner, I had the right to control what happened on my land, but I also had responsibilities to the environment through the conservation easement. Understanding both aspects helped me make better decisions throughout the conflict. Speaking of which, many of you have asked in the comments of my previous videos about setting up security systems similar to what I used. While I can't recommend specific brands, I would suggest working with professionals who understand both security and environmental monitoring. The combination of regular security cameras and wildlife monitoring cameras proved particularly effective in my case. I've also received questions about how to handle community pressure when standing up for your property rights. It's not easy, being painted as the bad guy for protecting what's legally yours. Remember that real community support doesn't require you to give up your rights. There are always better solutions that respect everyone's boundaries. For those wondering about the legal aspects, yes, I was fortunate to have a background in environmental law, but you don't need to be a lawyer to protect yourself. Many communities have legal aid organizations that can help property owners understand their rights. Local environmental groups can also be great resources if you're dealing with habitat protection issues. Some viewers have asked about Tom and his kids. I'm happy to report that they're doing well in their new home. The community college fund set up for the children has grown significantly, and Tom has become an advocate for financial literacy in our community, helping others avoid the kind of manipulation he experienced. Mrs. Rodriguez, who many of you have asked about, continues to lead our Neighborhood Watch program. She's even started consulting with other communities about setting up similar programs that focus on positive community building rather than just security. The environmental education program has expanded beyond our original goals. We now host regular workshops for adults as well as children, teaching everything from native gardening to wildlife photography. It's become a model for other communities looking to balance development with conservation. For those curious about the legal aftermath, Sarah remains in federal prison, though I heard she's been trying to organize community improvement projects even there. Some people never learn, I suppose. The various restitution payments are being handled through a court-appointed trustee, ensuring that all her victims will eventually receive compensation. The playground company made good on their promise to reform their practices. They've become leaders in environmentally conscious playground design, actually working with communities to create play spaces that enhance rather than destroy natural habitats. They sometimes bring their design teams to visit our natural play area for inspiration. Many of you have asked if I regret not giving in to Sarah's initial demands, suggesting it might have been easier to just let her have her way. The answer is no. While standing up to her was challenging and at times frightening, the outcome has been worth it. Our neighborhood is stronger, our environment is protected, and we've created something genuinely valuable for the community. If you're facing similar challenges, remember that you're not alone. The comments section of these videos has become a supportive community where people share their own experiences and solutions. Feel free to join the discussion below. Just remember to keep things civil and constructive. For those who've requested updates on the wetland restoration project, I've started a separate channel dedicated to environmental education and community building. You can find the link in the description below. We post regular updates on the wildlife returning to the area and share tips for creating your own natural spaces. Before I wrap up this video, I want to thank everyone who's followed this story from the beginning. Your support and insights in the comments have been invaluable. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more content about property rights, environmental protection, and building genuine community connections. And finally, to end where we began, sometimes the most entitled people can teach us the most important lessons about standing up for what's right. Sarah's playground scheme failed, but it led to something much better. A community that understands the value of both individual rights and collective responsibility. Stay tuned for my next video, where we'll explore another fascinating story about property rights and community conflicts. Until then, remember, good fences make good neighbors, but good neighbors make fences unnecessary. Take care, everyone, and thanks for watching. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.